Greetings, folks. Welcome to the Convocation Unscripted Live. This is a podcast at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. I'm your host, Jamar Tisby, and I am joined by Kristen Dumay.
Hey, Jamar, good to see you.
Good to see you. And Robbie Jones.
Hey, Jamar. Hey, Kristen.
And we are hopeful that Diana Butler Bass, our fourth co-host, will be able to join us. She is stuck in DC traffic right now, trying her hardest to get back just so she can hop on the mic with us. So she's with us in spirit, and hopefully we'll see her a little bit later in this episode. Of course, we are each scholars, three historians and one sociologist who write about religion and its intersection with culture, history, and politics in America. And we introduce a topic and we give our honest response in the moment. That's why it's called the Convocation Unscripted. And this episode of the Convocation Unscripted is now in session. So, this is our first recording after we have a new president. How are we all feeling? Kristen, what did you do on Monday? And in terms of like where you are emotionally right now, how would you describe it?
Oh man, what did I do on Monday? I had to even think. I met with a student research assistant in the morning and then kind of rushed home because I heard that things were starting up a little earlier than I had realized. And then I sat on the couch with my husband and daughter and watched it all play out. And I was just very deeply sad. Deeply sad to see this happening to our country and to think about the country that we are handing over to our children. Along with being sad, I confess, I have had this underlying current of anger, a lot of anger. And, as we're watching things play out for us here at the convocation, no surprises. Absolutely no surprises. All of this is playing out exactly as we told people it would, exactly as we were trying to, raise the alarms and being called alarmists for doing so, when really we had just paid attention and we're telling people exactly what they said they planned to do. And here we are. So, I'm working with some anger and sadness. And that's probably, best describes where I am.
And is the anger like we tried to tell you what was coming and folks didn't listen, or is it anger at what we're losing or what's happening?
It's all of it, all the directions, yes, it's frustration that, that we tried really hard to let people know what was coming on, what was coming down, in the hope that enough people would, regardless of where they stood on any single issue, would decide that our democracy was worth preserving. And to see kind of rounds of surprise or a little bit of the shock and awe coming down, right? That's the frustrating part because there was no mystery here. So yeah, I think anger that so many people that I know chose this.
And let me ask one more question before I get to your reactions, Robbie. What went into the decision, Kristen, to watch the inauguration? Because I know a lot of people sort of deliberately chose not to. Can
Yeah.
you take us into that?
Oh yeah. I'm a historian. It's history in the making. I just am always drawn to these things. I very much respect people who did not feel a need or desire to watch that. I think all of us are making choices and have to make some choices going forward. I'm trying to think about how to balance my exposure to the constant onslaught of just really hateful content and manipulative language and lies and cruelty that's just coming every time I go on social media or even just like read the news. And so I think, that's something that I think we can think about together, possibly going forward, how we protect ourselves while still staying informed. But I also thought, we're doing the convocation unscripted, and I know we're going to be talking about it. So one of the commitments that we've made is that we're tracking these things so that those who are tuning in don't have to track at the same level, and we'll try to kind of sift things out and distill things that we think are significant each week.
and I missed y'all last week, and so you may have said this, but it deserves reiteration. As the Convocation Unscripted, we are committing to doing these weekly through the first 100 days of this new presidency. So they won't always be live, but you'll have a weekly podcast from the four of us, or whatever combination thereof, particularly looking at the first 100 days of a presidency, which is always full of action and change, and this time around even more so than historically typical, I would say. So, Robbie, over to you. What'd you do on Inauguration Day, and how are you feeling about everything?
Yeah, well, just one little asterisk on the kind of what to expect. So I think what we settled on, right, is we're going to do first Thursdays live, and then the other weeks we will record and post. But in either case, it'll show up on your inbox if you're subscribed to the Convocations Substack. It'll show up in your inbox on Friday. If you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, it will be there also by Friday, usually 24-hour turnaround. So Friday midday, you should look for it either way, either via Substack or directly by YouTube, or it's also available as an audio podcast on Spotify and Apple. So any way you want to get it, we'll be there. It'll be about a 24-hour turnaround, but we'll try to, yeah, track things in real time. And this week, of course, we'd have to be doing this every hour to track things in real time because things are moving so fast. So let me kind of click through the emotions here. A little vertigo, I think, of just head spinning, thinking you're tracking it. And I've devoted, I mean, as we all have, a fair amount of, bandwidth to just tracking things, either on social media or, in kind of news stories to try to stay on top of it. But still, even there just feels like, wow, I mean, I can't even keep a list, that's got even the major things, up to date there. So that kind of sense of vertigo. I think also anger, some grief, both, yeah, kind of in the moment. And I think just that sense of anticipatory stress of knowing that, yeah, we're going to have to wake up to this a lot, right? And kind of what the daily outrage is going to be. And then the sense of like having to, and we're hoping that one of the things we can do here together, and as I say, we're all relying, Kristen and Jamar and Diane and I are all relying on each other too to kind of help winnow what's the noise, right? And what's the really important things to pay attention to? What do we need to settle in, focus on? Because that's where the real, resistance, being loud, those kinds of things really going to matter. So we're going to try to help each other sort all that out um, as we go. But I think just kind of stealing myself in a way, all of those things spinning around. I did not watch it in real time, and it's a good reminder too that I remember. My son's recovering from knee surgery, so we were like focusing on the medication schedule, and like that's the other thing to remember, like that life continues in the midst of all of this. And I think that's one of the hardest things is that we all have lives, we all have things happening in our lives, and trying to be responsible, right, to the public things while we're kind of managing the things that are happening in our private lives. I was just really, I guess, reminded of that reality as well.
So you did not watch it, but you caught up. You've been keeping up with the news around
Yeah,
it.
I watched it after the fact. I just didn't watch it live.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Well, I did not watch it. I was surprised a couple of months ago with an invitation to a gathering of Black Christian faith leaders um, on Inauguration Day. And I thought, well, what better way to spend Inauguration Day and MLK Day than gathering with faith leaders, plotting, strategizing, talking about how we would meet this moment. And so I was in a room with folks from all over the country who uh, shared a sense of grief, but also there were a lot of sort of classic messages from the Black Christian tradition about hope and resilience and resistance. And so it was inspiring. And honestly, I haven't kept up with a whole lot of news because I went straight from that, had less than 24 hours at home, and then came where I am now in the DC area at a retreat, another similar gathering of faith leaders, this time racially and ethnically diverse. So I've been in the midst of people who are actively trying to figure out next steps and what to do. And so also haven't had a whole lot of time to process my own emotions and where I am right now. Um, the first thing I can articulate is just like when you lose a loved one or something else happens, grief comes in waves. So for me, the first wave of grief was the election itself and the results. But then we had this interregnum between November and January 20, and then the inauguration happened. And now another new wave of grief has felt like it's swept over me because it's already happening. And they put out a 900-page report in Project 2025, and literally in the introduction, you didn't have to read hundreds of pages. It said this is a blueprint for what the next Republican president will do on day one, and they are executing on that. And they were so bold and confident that they put the plan out there, even though it eventually got attacked and picked apart, and it still wasn't enough. And so I share that anger, Kristen, that you're talking about. Like we saw the train coming and we just stood on the tracks. And now we're like mad, some of us, that we got hit. And I think there are other people who it really hasn't dawned on them yet what this new reality is going to be. It will maybe when the gas prices go up, or the eggs still are expensive or something. Maybe. I don't know. I don't have a whole lot of confidence in sort of the civic mindedness of the populace right now. So I'm angry. I'm also feeling a sense of urgency. Like all bets are off. Like the basically kind of the worst case scenario, politically speaking, has happened. And so now we got to go for it. We should have been going for it long before this, and he never should have gotten in office again. But now he is, and he's got his cronies with him. So there's no sort of internal checks on what he wants to do. And especially with Christians, I'm just like, yo, if not now, then when? And what are you waiting for? So it's this hodgepodge of feelings. Y'all have dived into some of the info, and I'm sure some of the things are pressing on you. So, Robbie, as you've been examining, even just it's less than a week. This is what, 3, 4 days in now.
Yeah.
What has stuck out to you?
Well, I do want to draw attention to just one part of the visual around the inauguration. So, as everybody knows, it got moved into the Capitol Rotunda, right? Ostensibly because of the cold. I'm sure it had something to do with maybe knowing that the crowds weren't going to be quite as big as they were before. And that, of course, was part of the whole like posturing, macho posturing was like having the biggest crowds, ever. But one of the things that I noticed that is, I think, symbolic inside of the Capitol Rotunda is there's a series of paintings in that rotunda. And those paintings actually express part of the battle that I think we're still struggling with today. These paintings are huge. If you haven't been there, they're 8 feet by 12 feet. They're massive paintings around the walls. Two of them depict, essentially a white European Christian nationalist vision of where the country came from and who it was designed to be. There's the landing of Columbus, planting his Christian flag, for Spain, even though, of course, Columbus never set foot in any soil that was to become the United States of America. But that's part of the kind of white Christian nationalist, mythology. And there was the Spanish claim by Hernando de Soto of this discovery of the Mississippi there. And in that painting, I actually talked about that painting in my last book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, because it is both of those actually are the enactment of the doctrine of discovery. Right, this claim that Europeans could just come here and claim these lands in the name of their Christian kingdom and God. And in both of them, they have these images of crosses literally being propped up in the midst of indigenous people who are cowering, before European power. And there's weapons, and there's crosses, and there's white Europeans claiming the land. And it just wasn't lost on me that we've had this struggle all the way back, and it is still like embodied on the pictures on the wall, right? And so in some ways, we're all lamenting that this is awful, and it feels new, and there are pieces of it in some ways the incarnation of it is new, but it is also a very old, right, battle, right, between are we a white Christian country, this divinely ordained, or are we a pluralistic democracy, right? And so there's a way in which Trump is like the awful embodiment of this older tradition in the country that we've never really vanquished. And so that was, I think, pretty deep with me there. One other thing I'll just mention is that is connected to all of that, of course, is just the cruelty of and the indifference to humanity, that this unleashing of these executive powers. And we could go down, pick one, right? But mostly they're about wanting to posture in this kind of macho, powerful way. But when you immediately shut down cancer research, when you immediately shut down people's employment, when you just break things willy-nilly to show that you can, right? The effect of that, I mean, so many people that I know here in DC have no idea, like, if they're going to be able to feed their family next month, right? Because their whole lives have just been put on hold by these and nobody knows what's going to be happening going forward. But that just indifference, right? To kind of, you just want to be able to make the big sweeping claim that you did X, Y, but without any sense of it, of how it actually affects, living people there. And I think that indifference and cruelty is something that's just been, very present with me as well.
It does feel like, it almost feels like they're posturing for the billionaires. Like these policies, when you ask them just about the policies, aren't altogether popular. Especially
Yeah,
the sort of
no.
scorched earth way they're doing it, right? Like, who are they doing this for? Who are they showing off for? I think part of it's like showing action at the beginning. What do y'all think of this? I heard somebody say, so to the point that, it's a very old phenomenon, right? Especially, I think this hierarchy with white moneyed men at the top, the use of violence, the sexism and patriarchy. Yes, we've seen elements of all of that before. Somebody said recently in one of these meetings I'm in that maybe the difference is, though, we've seen that at sort of the local and state level. It's really enshrined in a fresh way at the federal level and in the White House, where obviously we've had regressive presidents before. But do you think there's anything to that there's an element of, yes, we've seen these patterns before, but there's something particularly different about this time?
Yeah, I don't know if it's one of the things I was thinking of in connection with the big money, and when you look at the list of executive orders and you look at the ongoing agenda of Project 2025, just how much of it is actually focused on deregulationism, on extractive, right, oil, and using our resources, and who benefits from that? I mean, really, who benefits from that? And, it's always a good idea to follow the money. And I actually posted a thread on Blue Sky yesterday, just reminding people that there has been since the 1930s, and actually earlier than that too, but a deliberate strategy among conservative white Christians, including some mainline, but particularly starring the conservative white evangelicals, to demonize progressive Christians and even just moderate Christians who promote social justice, who promote the words of Christ, of caring for the least of these, who think that as a Christian, loving your neighbor means seeking the common good, which sometimes conflicts with corporate profits, with unrestrained corporate profits, right? And so there's this kind of idolatry of free market capitalism that has been just so thoroughly engrafted onto quote unquote Bible-believing Christianity. And you can see that in works by Sarah Hammond, God's Businessmen, Darren Grem's Blessings of Business, and Kevin Cruise's One Nation Under God. They lay it all out, and I just keep thinking about those works. And when I talk with reporters and get a lot of calls on Christian nationalism, this is actually something I try to bring up from time to time, because they want to focus on, okay, so what's the Christian nationalist element here? So what do they think about abortion? And we're going to talk about the 10 Commandments in schools, right? And those sorts of things. But there's a more expansive project here, and it is economic and at its foundation. And that explains partly why this effort has been so well funded. And it also explains this kind of newfound bromance between the tech bros and the theo bros. All right, there is really no disconnect here. You still have some of the old guard funders, the oil money and so on, especially coming from Texas, the Dunn brothers and so on. And then you have kind of these new alliances, and that also is nothing new. So to kind of get back to your question, is this new? Is this old? It's an amped up version of what we've seen before, but I feel like the world itself has shifted with social media and algorithms, and the power that these billionaires have is so much greater than the billionaires of the 1930s and the 1940s and 50s, right? So that's kind of, as a historian, how I'm grappling with some of this. But it's incorrect to kind of separate out the economic goals from the Christian nationalist agenda. And what serves both of those purposes are consolidation of power.
Contempt for government, I think, we're seeing coming home to roost in full form. That's been there really for sure since Reagan. But the open contempt just for all of it, I think and then the one last thing, since I've been into the kind of ritual and pageantry, it was notable to me that the tech bros were seated in front of members of Congress, right, at the inauguration.
And weren't some of them standing behind him as he took the oath?
Yeah, I think that's right too. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there she is. We'll welcome Diana here. We are just at the part of our conversation where we're going around and sort of talking about what we've been especially paying attention to or have had thoughts on since the inauguration. And now we're talking about, what's new. And I just love the definition of history. It's the study of continuity and discontinuity, right? So what is perhaps continuous with history that we're seeing right now? What's discontinuous? And I think one of the things that's different is the swift and substantive rollback of progress that we had once made. So historically, right, we're fighting for things like voting rights and universal health care and all of these things. And what we're seeing in very swift fashion is the rollback of that. So there have been periods in history where we didn't have that stuff and we were fighting to get it. And now we've had some of the things that we wanted in a democracy, and that's being taken away. That's being taken back. And so that is what I think, even emotionally, is such a gut punch. Is like, no, 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 we had it. It's almost like, so I'm a big Formula One racing fan. And the way it works in terms of like rule violations in Formula One is you can have an entire race, complete the race, and place in the race, first, second, third. But the stewards, who are the referees, can go back and look at particular violations that they can only sort of take a longer look at once the race is done. And you can actually lose your place after you had crossed the finish line. So there have been several races every season where a first place finisher lost their first place. They were second or third or were disqualified because of going back and looking at what happened. Now, in that case, you want to hope that the stewards are making a just decision. But in this case, we are losing the progress we made due to unjust and nefarious actors who are in it literally for the money. For me, what is really galling is the grift. what is just so blatant that I feel like we've lost the plot on is so much money being made by these political actors and the people in their orbit, which nobody left or right, I would think, is just like two thumbs up, that's cool with us. So narrative wise, and we'll get to this later, but narrative wise, I do think talking about the money, talking about the grift, talking about who's benefiting from this, because none of us are part of that 0.001%. And they are exploiting our political mechanisms for their literal monetary gain as well as political power. So, um, but let's welcome Diana. Is there either one of you can go first? I just want to sort of get a sense of what you've got your eyes on since the inauguration, and what sticks out to you.
The first thing that I have my eyes on is taking care of people who are in my Substack community. It's such a big, amazing community of folks. And when the all those events of Inauguration Day started rolling out, I had literally thought I wasn't going to watch anything. I watched very little. But I also thought I'm not going to write anything because I'd written on Sunday. And then Monday unfolded, and I thought, you know what, I'm feeling pretty crappy about this. So if I'm feeling pretty crappy, maybe the 60,000 people who are on my Substack page, they might be feeling crappy too. And so I just decided that I would write. And that day I put out a poem and something else, was just trying to kind of cheer up the troops. And people loved it so much that I said, hey, maybe I'll do something the next day. So I've basically written every day until today, um, since last Sunday. And so I think that my eyes have been very much on that emotional response of that community, and just knowing that there are so many people who didn't want to feel alone, who don't feel safe. So that was sort of the pastoral Diana was over there doing that work. And then the more Jeremiah prophetic Diana has been paying attention to how fast the rollout has been. I think that and I wouldn't be surprised if all three of you have said something like this while I was driving in traffic. Uh, but I think the four of us, we were well aware that Project 2025 was terrible and that it was well planned. And I think that, but there was always this little part of me that reminded myself that evangelicals often talk a big game, since so many of them are white evangelicals. They often talk a big game, but when it sort of came down to executing the game, they would really mess up. And this is not that. This is utterly disciplined. It is completely planned. It has massive amounts of money behind it. It has power. And the thing that, just to listen to Jamar, what's different about this, historically, is all of that stuff. Is that, yeah, sure, there have been white supremacists in the presidency before. Hello, many presidents, most of them, Woodrow Wilson, we got that. But it wasn't like Woodrow Wilson was sitting in his office plotting to take apart the United States government on the basis of white supremacy. No, he was a cultural white supremacist. It was awful. He was from the mountains in the Western Virginia. I mean, we get it. We understand that historically he did lots of things wrong because of his cultural biases and where he lived and how he lived and who he paid attention to. But he didn't walk into the White House saying, hey, I think it'd be a really good idea to drown government in a bathtub and take away people's rights. That was not really the first thing I think it was on his mind. And so this, however, is a full-on open assault on everything that has been created since about 1950 in terms of the protections of the rights and the expansion of democracy and creating a better kind of America. And it is going fast. And it is, like I said, disciplined and well financed and incredibly well planned. And so there's pastoral Diana trying to take care of people, which I think is an incredibly important job right now. And then there's Diana, who is looking at this and saying they are doing it far more effectively than I feared that they actually would. And every hour we lose more ground. And so what I'm watching is that loss and trying to figure out how you navigate the need to think about what we're going to do in relationship to what is being taken away with the equal and necessary need for grief. So those are the two parts of Diana, trying to integrate them, keep them in conversation with each other. My husband doesn't know which Diana is going to show up around the dinner table. And that's where I am. It's an honest assessment of the brutality of this moment. And it is a brutality. It's a full-on attack of everything that many of us love. And on the other hand, the heartfelt Diana who knows that people need to be held.
We appreciate all of Diana and what you bring, especially in this moment. Kristen, you didn't really get a chance to respond to this particular question, and you watched the whole thing and have been observing for the past few days. So, same thing, like what's sticking out to you? What is on your mind around the actions that have been taken or what this moment means right now?
Oh, so much, so much really. 2 points. One builds on Robbie's point of just the cruelty, right? There's a cruelty in terms of the executive orders, but we should also mention the complete pardon of all of the J6 criminals. And what message that sends, and it is a very intentional message, and it is consistent with things that Trump has signaled multiple times over his political career, which is if you do violence on his behalf, he will get you off the hook. And let's just stop for a moment and reflect on that and how that will change our culture, how it will instill fear in the hearts of the opposition, as it is meant to do, and how it will embolden the worst actors on the other side. And again, that is exactly what it was defined to do. And it's just so galling too, right? You know, what about Back the Blue, right? These are people who assaulted, right? Murdered police officers, or resulted in the loss of life, and absolutely, a vicious attack on democracy. And it's all cool. It's all cool. So it's not even what that means for what happened. It's what it means for what will happen. Along with that too, the question of religious liberty is something that has really been on my mind this past week since the inauguration. And then we can probably talk about Bishop Budde too. I know there's a lot of folks in the comments who want to go there, and I think we all do. And we are stalling so that Diana would get back in time to be a part of this, because I know Diana, the bishop. But I'll start it off with this juxtaposition between what we saw at the inauguration itself and the pre-inauguration events, where we had Franklin Graham and these podcasters that I wrote about who are praying and channeling that complete conflation of God's will with Donald Trump. The man, his agenda, his character, all of that, and praying for spirit and praying that God will protect him from his enemies, by which presumably they mean us, right? And And that kind of a Christian nationalist framing versus what we saw at the inauguration prayer service in the sermon of Bishop Budde, which is a whole other kind of Christianity, a whole other way to bring Christianity into the political sphere in a self-critical way, in a humble way, and in a deeply principled way. So I don't know who wants to kind of talk more about that, but I would love to reflect on what it was that we saw and maybe what we can learn from that going forward.
I'll jump in. I just want to jump in on before we leave the January 6th thing. And I do want to toss to Diana to talk about the cathedral and the sermon that has kind of gone around the country. I've seen it everywhere. Right. But just one quick little thing on January 6th is that, what's clear, right, is that this was necessary for Trump to do. Because it was the only way to fully rewrite history about the insurrection, right? And make it so that the insurrection, that word couldn't even be used, right? If he succeeds in rewriting history. So this was all along absolutely necessary, because the one thing Trump never let go of is the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen from him, right? And so this was the completion of that arc that he just had to do it. And also, like, the fact that even JD Vance was trying to make this distinction between violent and nonviolent. And so, of course, we shouldn't pardon the ones that were violent. And, pardon my French, but I think the crude thing Trump was like, fuck it, pardon them all. Right. That's the character, right? That's the flippancy with which he finally made the decision, and he made it. He's like, he was certainly going to push it, but he was like, you know what? Forget all that, right? We're not even going to go through the motions of trying to sort out violent versus nonviolent. And so for the party of law and order, supposedly, I mean, this is quite shocking, right? These were people who were attacking police officers, right, at our U.S. Capitol, and kind of remember all that. And then the last thing I posted on Blue Sky about this, and just a reminder that you can all find now, all four of us, thank you, Jamar, for joining, all of us now on Blue Sky, us individually, and the Convocation actually has an account as well on Blue Sky there. But I posted on this because it's notable that, like, we polled on this right before the election, and it's only I say only, but it's only 25% of the country that agree with Trump's crazy assertion that the people convicted of and this, we asked about the people who were convicted, not just who were there, but people who convicted of their role in the violent January 6 attacks on the U.S. are really, U.S. Capitol, are really patriots who are being held hostage by the government. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? Only 25% of Americans agreed. But this was right before the election. But by the election, Trump had convinced nearly half of Republicans that this was true. And if you look among Republicans, and this is like the lie begets the lie that begets fealty formula. If you look at Republicans who believed his big lie that the 2020 election was stolen, it's 2/3 that believe that the people convicted for their role in the violent January 6th attacks at the U.S. Capitol are really patriots who are being held by the government. So these lies just kind of lock people in to this worldview, and they lock people into Trump, where they've just already checked their consciences at the door, right, for any future things. So that's me on January 6th. But let's go to that other building down on Capitol Hill. Actually, not on Capitol Hill. Actually, it's
sort of above Capitol Hill.
Above Capitol Hill, Capitol Heights. Yeah.
I just had to ask Kristen a quick question about German history, and I do want to stay just on the J6 thing for one more second. Didn't Hitler recruit most of the brown shirts from people who he got out of jail?
That may well be. I'd have to go back, and it's been a long time since I've read those books.
Okay, I just have a vague memory about that. I thought you might know that off the top of your head, but that's what I've been thinking the whole time. As soon as he pardoned them, I went brown shirts,
Yeah, we now have shock troops who have their get out of jail free card, regardless.
Yes.
Yeah.
That part is what stood out to me in terms of this week's actions, because it reminds me so much of Andrew Johnson. So Lincoln is assassinated in 1865. He had chosen Andrew Johnson sort of as a way to bring the North and the South back together, because Johnson was a Tennessean, a dyed-in-the-wool white supremacist, and when Lincoln is assassinated, he takes over and he pardons the Confederates. I mean,
Right.
they basically get off with a slap on the wrist. They have to rewrite their state constitutions, but that is quickly rescinded during the Jim Crow era. And so that gets to Brian Stevenson's quote, "The North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war," because they were never held to account. I mean, the only thing worse than the actual crime itself is not being held accountable for it. And we've seen this now already in the boldness of people. Yes, the people pardoned. So the QAnon shaman comes out and says, "I'm going to go get me some guns because I'm not a felon anymore."
And he used a bad word too.
A bad word? I didn't
Very
read.
bad word.
Okay.
And saying that online, yes.
Yep.
So these folks are emboldened. Enrique Tarrio, right? These folks convicted of seditious conspiracy, like very rare to get a conviction on that. Now you think they're gonna go and like get a job at Home Depot and just be an upstanding citizen? No, they're coming back bolder than ever. And that's the extremes. I read a news story today about a high school in Hollywood where a group of students who were all Trump supporters and celebrating the inauguration, dressed up in their MAGA gear and hats, and went around first just celebrating, but it quickly turned to harassing other students, particularly black students and students of color.
Right.
And so this is a high school in LA. And this is the kind of walking around with their shoulders back, heads up. We won. We have a mandate. Nobody can tell us what to do. And it was just an exclamation point on that feeling by pardoning nearly 1,500 people. And of course, as a black person who was supportive of Black Lives Matter as a movement, which was fundamentally sparked as an anti-black against anti-black police brutality. And we know the way law enforcement came down on protesters. We know the reaction of many people, including many Christians, of Blue Lives Matter in reaction to Black Lives Matter, and how vitriolic the response would be if any person of color was assaulted a police officer. And now you have people. So I wrote on social media, I said, so it's only back the blue when black folks protest police brutality, but
Right.
not when a mob of Trump supporters assaults the police. The
That's right.
hypocrisy is loud. So just to add to your point, Kristen, that is what is really so upsetting to me. Is there's no these are the law and order party, right? But again, not when it's in service of Trump, of MAGA. And now the last thing I'll say on this, plausible deniability. So now he does have shock troops, paramilitary, who he can say, well, I never told them to do anything bad, but they will. This is the same approach he took with the January 6th riots, insurrection, right?
Fine
So
people
so
all
now you
around.
have these folks all around the country who can do all these acts in support of this regime, and they can wipe their hands of it.
Yeah.
So back to you, Diana. Talk about the prophetic preaching in this moment.
Well, this is why I love hanging around with you all, because the Andrew Johnson thing is the closest to a white supremacist coming into an office out of the presidency with a plan to actually reverse the gains of a democratic fight over rights. So anyway, thank you, Jamar. That was an important thing to say. I appreciate it. Now, the National Cathedral. Okay, well, I can tell you a few little inside things. So these are things you won't really hear on the national news, or maybe only bits and pieces. I knew that was going to happen back in June, because I had already approached the bishop and said, if Trump happens to win, are you guys going to hold an inauguration prayer service? Because 8 years ago, I made a national sort of ruckus about them holding that first prayer service that really turned the Episcopal Church on its head. And there are people in the Episcopal Church who still don't talk to me to this day because I made such a stink about them holding a prayer service for Donald Trump. And so I needed to talk to the bishop about this in advance. And so she and I had a very interesting conversation about it. This is where Diana, as an Episcopalian, which is part of what we call the magisterial reformation, which is all about sort of the church baptizing the state and all this kind of thing. This is where I begin to sound a lot more like a Baptist. Which will make Robbie and Jamar very happy. No, Jamar's more reformed, but
Yeah.
well,
The
Jamar
word
has
magisterial didn't get a lot of play in Baptist circles, I gotta say.
yeah, well, Jamar has mixed feelings on this one. He's liberation black theology. That's a whole different thing. But so I'm more of a Baptist here, and I have always thought that National Cathedral service was really a dumb thing, because essentially it was just like Episcopalians who were playing like they were the Archbishop of Canterbury, and that they were doing an anointing for the new president king. I mean, they literally, there's whole parts of that service that were picked up from the service to anoint the king of or queen of England when there's a new ruler. And so it's literally like Episcopalians liking to play dress up and pretending that they still have a king. And so I think it's a very disturbing historical precedent and liturgical one. So I didn't want to make a scene this time. And she told me that they were still a little up in the air, and they were trying to decide between not having a service or having this thing that she called a service for the nation that would not be supported in any way, shape, or form by the Presidential Inauguration Committee, and that they would be in charge of it. There would only be they'd invite suggestions from whoever would be the new president, and that she would preach. And I thought, well, if they go on with the service, that's probably the best choice. So I knew this, and, we kind of had some exchanges about it in the run up to the election. And right after the election, I asked her, what is that what's going to happen? And she said, yeah, we decided to do this service for the nation, and I am going to preach. So I have been praying for her. And what you saw was the result of that long incubation period of, I think, mostly Mariann Budde seriously taking the responsibility of what it was going to be, and what she would say. So that's the first part, is that there was a lot of internal argument about whether or not it should even happen, and that's good. I think they probably had some good discussions. I was only on the edges of it. But if we talk about the service, especially the sermon itself, this is the piece that I don't know if you all saw. I put out on my Substack the whole sermon for people to listen to. It was almost 15 minutes long. And you go through the first 12 minutes of it, and it's a good sermon. It's a very good sermon on unity, why unity is important to a nation and to a community, and that there are 3 foundational points to unity. The respecting the dignity of every person, telling the truth, and then oh well, it will come to me. So they're all Christian virtues. Humility, thank you so much. So the necessity of humility towards unity. So great stuff. The last 3 minutes, the part that went viral around the world, Robbie, not just the United States. It's a global phenomenon right now. She didn't decide to do that until immediately before she started to preach. So the end of the sermon would have not had the original ending of the sermon did not have that. And the people who are in the National Cathedral approval group that looked at the sermon in advance, they didn't know she was going to do that. She didn't know she was going to do it. And she said that when she got to the actual task at hand, she thought about what the previous day had been like. And already the trans order the thing on gender that had already come out, and the immigrant orders that had already come out, and how many people she knew were afraid. And so she decided at the very last minute to throw in that piece, to speak to Trump directly, sitting there 40 feet away from her, and make that plea. And it wasn't really like begging, it was like reminding him that he was a human being and that he actually has a moral responsibility in the office to those things: the dignity of others, speaking truth, and being humble. And out of that, a good leader, a good ruler, will be merciful. And so those two things I think are interesting for this group to know, is that there was conversation, it's extensive conversation about whether or not to actually have the service. Then I certainly put my 2 cents worth in there and had some pretty strong opinions about it. But once the decision was made, I really stood behind her and still do. And I think that she rose so beyond admirably to the moment, given the context and everything that it means. I mean, her tradition, that's a prophetic sermon in the Episcopal tradition. So
Yeah, and the Holy Spirit moving during a sermon at an Episcopal church, says the Baptist.
you're
Thumbs up.
telling the preacher to say something she hadn't planned. Woo! Pentecost, man.
Yeah.
She
I'll
was
just
wearing
say
red.
it. What stuck out to me in the aftermath is like this is a preview of how this administration will treat different churches, denominations, and faith leaders.
Yes.
Right? It's not enough to say I'm a Christian like you. No. You're not their kind of Christian. There's already been, I would say, at least since the first Trump administration, a sifting going on in a lot of churches where churches are sort of declaring themselves as MAGA congregations. They'll be fine. They'll get probably extra privileges, but there will be prophetic churches, churches that are sanctuaries for undocumented immigrants, churches that are speaking out prophetically against injustice. They're not the okay churches. And so I just think it's important to articulate that simply being a Christian, simply being clergy or part of a church community, and I do mean church, not faith communities broadly, because we already know they're not excited about Muslims or Hindus or Sikhs or anything else, right? Anyone else. But you have to be, for them, the right kind of Christian. And her sermon and what she stands for and everything like that put her and the National Cathedral, probably broadly, into a category that's going to face and already is facing intense persecution, intense scrutiny and vilification. And I think that's at the literal national level. I think at the local community level, a lot of that's going to be true to varying degrees as well. So it's just like it's not. Again, this goes back to the white Christian nationalism is not truly Christianity in the sense that it looks like Jesus. And here's one of the ways it's going to show up. Other thoughts on this really sort of ground shaking moment from the pulpit?
I actually said, just real quickly, this is the kind of last thing I'll say about it unless somebody asks me. When I put the whole piece out, I encourage people to not just rest on a single sermon. It's not about which she did, and I hope embolden many people. And over the next years, we're going to need hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more of those kinds of sermons, each one of them being contextualized theologically within certain kinds of traditions. But to do what she did with that kind of courage, that needs to be a model for all of us. And if you're not a pastor who has a pulpit to preach from, put on your big girl pants and start preaching to your friends. You can do that.
I would say too, to add to what Jamar was saying, that right there, the wrong kind of Christians. And within the Christian nationalist framing, right? It's Christianity versus the enemies of God, right? Christianity versus everybody else, real Americans versus the enemies of real America, right? Which is why there is so much vitriol that comes at those of us who are also Christians, right? Who say, wait, no, as Christians, we are not going along with your agenda. As Christians, we are pointing in a different direction, right? And this is, again, strategy on their part. If you notice, Trump initially, when he was asked right after that service, he said something like, well, it wasn't very, very exciting, right? It was pretty boring, which, you know, compared to the kind of charismatic services that he goes to, fair, fair critique. It was only after all sorts of pastors, especially the white evangelicals, are out there just absolutely demonizing her, trashing her, right? Representatives and you know, our Speaker Johnson came out and just trashing her. Now, this is a deliberate tactic, right? To punish her and to send a message to other pastors and other churches that if you do this, and that this was relatively harmless, like, right, it was a gracious message, it was a pastoral comment. If you listen to the whole sermon, she was, you know, speaking to herself as much as to anybody, right? Doesn't matter, because what she did, they recognized as a threat, as a serious threat to their entire framing of the entire landscape here, right? And so they have to attack fellow Christians. This is something I've been saying, you know, in every interview I can get it in, is that the most likely targets, right, apart from kind of the usual suspects, LGBTQ and undocumented immigrants or immigrants generally, wait and see, is going to be fellow Christians for all their talk of religious liberty, right? These folks, look at those comments. Look at the comment from the Speaker of the House. Look at the threat of deportation, right? Now tell me what religious liberty means.
Right. And we're going to have to get behind women clergy, I think, especially because they are going to have targets on their back. You know that word, I think somebody's put it in the comments, I was thinking it too. You know, Trump rolled out his favorite adjective for women he doesn't like: nasty.
Nasty. Yeah. That came a few hours later, right? When he's like, oh, wait, we can use this.
Right. But if you think about like that sermon and that adjective, I mean, it's just so jarring to, and the other thing that struck me is that she was actually acknowledging his power in that sermon, right? She was saying you have, and not saying he was the illegitimate president. She was saying, you are the president. You won the election. You now have this power. And what does God require of those who have power? Right? Is to have mercy. Right? That's the Christian. And like that was the message. That was the controversial one. And Kristen, you posted, I flagged it too. Like the pastor, what's his name, who was a member of Doug Wilson's church,
Joe Rigney,
who called it out and said, this is what happens when women get ordained. Empathy runs rampant.
Yeah.
And that was terrible. Right? So back to like, compassion, empathy, that these actually are, and we should say like, they're really saying the quiet part out loud there. Those are things that are directly opposed to Christian nationalism. All right. But they've now got to kind of figure out how to weave together Christianity that has empathy and compassion as a vice.
Chris, what was that term? Inside something moderate? What is it?
Yes, attacking the in-group moderate. Right, yes. That's really, really key here. And you know, those are folks, Christians, fellow Christians in this case. We already saw, you know, any resistors within the Republican Party have been severely punished, and they are no more, you know, within the party. This is a classic, again, everything playing out according to the classic, well-worn authoritarian playbook. This is one of those things, going after in-group moderates. And putting them on display. So I don't know Bishop Budde, but she sure seemed to be a kind of soft-spoken person, not somebody who tries to grab the limelight, not somebody who wanted to be the center of this firestorm. Yet here she is. But she's holding up well and she's speaking her truth, and more power to her. But yes, we need all of us, rather than having this be a warning and, oh, I don't want that to happen to me, right? I'm going to just shut my mouth now. That's exactly what this is designed to do. What we need is the opposite.
That's
Like
right.
you said, pastors, all of us speaking truth all the time. And then when one of us gets targeted, we got to back them. Whoever it is, we have to show our support.
And that's what I was going to just point out here at the end. It's really easy to go to the attack piece, which we need to do. We need to be aware of how that's being used as a tactic against us and what it's intended to do. Yet, when you look like on social media, it's just been an extraordinary outpouring from people who are not famous, who do not hold seats in Congress. I understand I know that Tracy Blackman, who is a leader in the United Church of Christ, put out a petition supporting Mariann, and it's gotten I don't know how many signatures at this point, 100,000, more than that signatures. The National Cathedral is just like flooded with donations. It's been a lot of people saying, I can support this. I can stand with her. And so I think that we're going to have to learn to look at both places, both in the scheming tyrant place to see what they're up to and how they're trying to manipulate history and the circumstances we're in. And we need to keep looking toward the people who are more off the radar and say, wow. I mean, I think that the response to the sermon from regular people has been even more extraordinary
Beautiful.
than what the expected bad guys are saying.
Very
I can see
beautiful.
that clip now, right now, in woke preachers. So anyway, that's all right.
So I'm just gonna
The bad guy, the expected bad guy clip.
y'all, we're going a little longer than we typically do.
sorry.
That's because an inauguration happens once every 4 years, and this is a historic one. So we just got to let this conversation flow. And feel free to stay on or hop off. We will get to questions in a second, but I still sense we got a little bit of juice in us to continue to talk about this. One thing I'll say, a couple of things. Gosh, one. I don't know how to say this, but I feel like we know each other well enough that you can hear my heart behind it. Is this was a massively significant speak truth to power, speak truth in love moment because of the inauguration, because the president was in the presence right there, and you got to say that to somebody who's 40 feet away, the most powerful person in the country, if not the world, right? That is few of us could have probably risen to that occasion. And thank God for the Holy Spirit. Thank God the Holy Spirit for that moment and for Reverend Budde's courage. I also want us to remember the people who have been speaking up about it and the ones who will continue to speak up about it who don't have the similar platform and profile. Um, I often feel uh, there are many who are overlooked who've been doing this work. And I just want to gently put that out there for us to bear in mind. There's a lot of vectors of this around race, around gender and class, about why certain folks aren't in these conversations or why certain folks aren't held up for their courage. But that's just a reminder um, that there are pointed moments like this that she absolutely stepped up, and that was I cannot wait to meet her one day. That would be so awesome. Um, but also, right? The other thing I want to talk about is so much of like, so there's part of me that's just like Diana, grieving, and also, what the heck do we do? And I keep thinking of um, narratives. narratives and counter-narratives. We mentioned Darren Grimm's book, The Blessing of Business. He was on my dissertation committee at the University of Mississippi. And as I was developing my dissertation, he was sort of coaching me through how to make an argument. And he's like, you're Christian, so you'll be familiar with this phrase. And he said, what you're trying to do is add to the argument. And think of it this way, what Jesus said, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. So much of the rank and file, grassroots MAGA supporters have heard it said that white Christian nationalism is Christian, that this anti-immigration, anti-LGBTQ, anti-DEI, whatever you want to put in, is the Christian way. And so much of our responsibility right in this moment, this is just one part of it, but a big part of it is the counter narrative of you have heard it said, but we say unto you something else, something different, something generative, something inclusive, something more Christ-like. Now, that's not enough, though, because as we all know, we live in a very noisy, information age digital environment. And so I think part of what we need to do, and a lot of people are asking, how can we support? Who are you listening to? Voices that are helpful right now? And how can you actually support them even more? Or for the first time? Rather than just being consumers of these thoughts, this research, this knowledge, because we know the media landscape has changed. We know the information landscape has changed. We know that the right, in terms of politics, had an absolute megaphone. And so much of what the other narrative was came through as a whisper in many ways. So that I can go into deeper detail, but I just want to put that out there as number one, let's not underestimate or devalue the role of continually truth-telling and refuting lies. Because if we stop, then what's going to happen, right? But also, can we get more effective at it? Can we be more strategic about it? So I just want to put that in there. Any final thoughts, and then we'll switch to Q&A.
I'm ready for
I think
Q&A.
we're good to go.
Very
And
good.
we were also chided in the chat here for talking too much and not letting Robbie get in. So
That is the first time in
white
my
guy-
life anybody has ever said that. I just want to let you know that.
I know. I saw you smirk there, Robbie. So
I love it.
This is so in the interest of giving white men their due.
Yes,
Robbie,
these
what should we
persecuted
do
white
going
men.
forward?
World upside down. So I don't know. No, I really do think we should go to some questions, Jamar. Let's hop in and do some questions.
I'll give you.
I'll make sure I
the
speak first. I don't know, and
Yes.
loudly and longly, and maybe I'll interrupt a few of you along the way too.
This person put question marks behind it, but it wasn't really a full sentence or question. But I think they're just saying, like, are you going to comment on this? Musk raising the Nazi salute. That's to you, Robbie.
Oh, yeah. Look, I think I used the word Nazi for the first time in July. When we heard the word vermin and poisoning the blood of the country, because I'm not a historian, but I play one here on TV. It's Mein Kampf, right? I mean, that language is right out of Mein Kampf. And so Trump's been using Nazi language, not just like abhorrent, but like actual, and not Nazi-like language, but actual Nazi language, for all of the campaign, right? Against immigrants. And so it's really stunning to see that there, from the find people on both sides, when the kind of neo-Nazis in Charlottesville were chanting "Jews will not replace us." All of that has been there, right? All along. And so in some ways, I actually wasn't that surprised, and I'll just say this, like, the one thing I have not heard Musk say is that it was not a Nazi salute. Now, if I accidentally at a public event went out and sort of like did one of these, and it was like trying to dab and did the white guy thing and didn't know how to do it, and ended up like doing a Nazi salute, I mean, the first thing I would be saying is like, hold on, y'all. Like, Nazis are bad. They're evil. I am nowhere in no way wanting to kind of affiliate myself with them. All right. But we got the same kind of half kind of, half denials that we got from Trump all along. Right. I don't know anything about that. Just that kind of obfuscation. But that is a tactic. It is an intentional tactic of plausible deniability while sending a signal to the far right to unleash the Kraken. I mean, it really is not accidental. And if it were, we would have heard very immediately that a full-throated, full stop denial. And if you don't hear a full-throated, full stop denial about something that is attached to the Nazis of all things, you know where he stands.
Great points.
Best
Kristen, I know you love
answer
these
I've heard of
questions.
that all week.
Yeah, that was deep. That was wow. Kristen, I know you love these questions. How do we parent and guide our impressionable kids through this?
Oh, I was hoping I wouldn't get
Oh, wait, I
that.
just want to talk over Kristen for a minute. Okay, now you can go.
Robbie's a parent too here. You guys are parents. Man, I could tell some stories, except I'm just so careful to keep my kids out of these conversations for obvious reasons. They've been targeted in the past, and so I can't really bring the personal anecdotes that I would like to. Um, I don't know, age appropriate, obviously, but I have not been shielding my kids from what's going on. And I, had to explain to them why I was on the road for the better part of a year and why I thought that was important. And the honestly, I was upfront with them months ago about the risks that I was taking on, and that as part of as my kids, I said, and you're kind of on the hook here too, and I'm sorry about that. Um, their response has been really incredible. And seeing what is good and true and right, and seeing that this is a moment that may require a lot from each of us. And I have just been so inspired, I'll say that generally, by my own children and their clarity and their courage, even though they know some of the ways that it might cost us. And I just think that we should, right, this moment is asking a lot of us, of all of us, including our kids, and it is their future. And honestly, I would, if there's a price to be paid, I would rather, pay it for, acts of courage and pursuing justice and goodness than having my own kids get swept up in this movement.
That's why you get these questions. It's such a rich answer. I'll weigh in as well. As a parent of a teenager who's a Black boy in this country, I haven't shielded him either. And also, as a former sixth grade teacher and middle school principal, I can tell you that there was no greater influence on the views, perspective, and habits of our students than the adults in their lives outside of school. And so I say that because I want to remind adults, parents, guardians, you have a lot of influence on the kids in your life, a lot of influence. And I've seen that just by listening to certain news programs in the morning on the way to school, to him looking over my shoulder as I'm scrolling through news stories, right? Those begin to become organic opportunities for conversation. So by you being concerned about this, active in this, courageous in this, they pick up on that. And just like we're seeing middle schoolers, teenagers get swept up and radicalized in some really violent, unhealthy, dangerous stuff, we can also influence the young people around us to be justice minded and compassionate and empathetic. And so I really do believe that our most important means of discipleship for the young people in our lives is our personal witness, mediated through loving relationship, right? We can't have these authoritarian, do what I say, don't talk back. You have to show human beings, but especially kids, you care about them on a human level. And then that's an opening to help explain why you do what you do and why you commend it to them in their lives as well. So I think it's a really important question because as adults, we're all feeling this. Kids, even if they're not watching the news, they're seeing us react to this, and it is important that we are conscientious, proactive on all this. Now, I know all of us are parents, but we've got some more questions.
Hey, Jamar, I just want to say we're on the way to the next question. You showed up in my son's AP history class
Now
on
that's a
video, and
surprise.
he sent me a text in the middle of the day. He's like, "It's Jamar."
No way.
Yeah. So
Um,
anyway, so
I
you're
hope in a
getting out there
positive
to the
way.
young folks. Yep.
There are varying questions, Diana, around how we can get more pastors to do what Reverend Buddy did, to speak truth to power the way she did, to have that courage. Any offerings of advice?
Yes, actually, on the couple days after the election, I went to my own pastor and I said to her, so I think it's really important. Women pastors, especially women of color who pastor, really need some extra protection. I just asked her kind of what was going on. She gave a kind of a half-hearted sermon that first Sunday, and I wanted to know why, because she's usually a very brave preacher. And so she said, oh, I just didn't know what to say. And, she was feeling the weight of it. She was worried about the people who might have voted for Trump in our congregation, which wouldn't have been very many, but nevertheless, they're there. And so I said, one of the things I want to do, I'm not super wealthy, but I have some resources. And if anybody comes to you and tells you to not preach something, or they're going to take their money away from the church, you come to me and I will make up the pledge. And she said, "Oh my gosh, nobody's ever said anything like that to me." And I'm not sure if you all can think about that, but if you have any kind of resources and can back a brave pastor, do that and make sure they know you're going to do that. And so then, I sent in a much bigger pledge check at the end of the year to prove that I was going to put my money where my mouth was. And that's one thing that lay people can really do, because what happens is the people who get angry at sermons like Mariann Budde's sermon, they're going to be the first people there and they're going to be threatening. So what that pastor needs is that pastor needs to know that there are all the other people there who will stand up with and for them. So I think that's an incredibly beautiful, practical thing that so many pastors, they just need to know that you're with them, you're behind them, and that when stuff hits, they're not going to be alone. And that you're going to make sure they don't lose their job and make sure that they are safe. And the only way that that happens is if the congregation rallies. So that's my main suggestion, is not to pastors. There are so many brave pastors and pastors who I think are getting braver, or at least want to be braver, but they can't do it by themselves and they need their congregations. So if you're in a congregation, make sure that pastor knows you got his or her back and you are not going to let threats take them down.
The simple suggestions are often the most profound, right? Like it's just right there. And I don't think I've heard anyone articulate that. So thank you, Diana. Robbie, there was another question about like what organizations can we support? Whether that's around policy or, Christian or faith communities, or do you have any sense of how folks might truly support folks who are doing this work?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about this too, along these lines, people who are white and Christian, if we're not uncomfortable leveling it right, if you have a financial advisor and they're not sending you emails of concern about the level of money you're wanting to give away, I think you're not doing it right. So I think that's just the time we're in, right? And so I think there's of course some like national organizations, but there are local organizations that don't get the kind of grant support money that national organizations are often able to get. So I think looking at those local organizations that are looking out, so just who's being targeted and who's looking out for those folks, right? In the local community, because those people like $10,000 to those groups is a lot of money, right? And may make a difference, right, in what they can actually do at the local level. So I think immigrant any groups that are working in immigrants, refugees, LGBTQ people, transgender people, like all the groups that are just being overtly targeted in this first wave of things. I think that is like ought to be front and center. It doesn't take that long to kind of do a quick Google in your local community, talk to people who ask your local pastors, who those groups are, and make the investment and make it early. Don't wait till to December, right when most of us, I'm guilty of this too. Start thinking, oh wait, the deadline's up. I got to like think about like making sure I've made all my charitable donations, but making it earlier in the year. So even if you're capable of doing it, even if you just gave in December, thinking about giving again first quarter, and then have it be a first quarter thing, particularly in this given year. But I really do think, we're trying to live this out in our family as well, like like doubling what we usually do this year, because that's the kind of year it is.
Robbie, that is so important because one of the things, if you think about the all these orders that are related to Project 2025 that have come out, this is part of 4 years of specifically planning for this moment that they didn't even know was going to happen. They just said, well, let's plan on winning, and this is the plan we're going to do. So already those of us who find this to be just horrible, which it is, we're 4 years behind. And somebody said that to me today. Well, we're already 4 years behind them. And I said, yeah, 4 years and about $30 billion because Elon Musk is sitting right next to Donald Trump and just throwing money at everything he wants to do. And that's the other piece. We're behind in our time schedule and we have to catch up. So there's a level of urgency here, but we're also behind in cash. And to hear you make that plea, I mean, that's what we're thinking about in our family too. And I just made that pretty clear. I can't really afford 2 pledges in my church, but I will do what I can to fill that gap up. And then also, I'm looking around and I'm looking at organizations very specifically. And we talked to our financial people um, just a couple weeks ago about this very thing. How can we give more? And where do we want to put it? And we want to be very strategic about this as well. So we all have to free up money. That those of us who can, there are people who can't, and the people who can't, please do not feel left out of this conversation because we also need your prayers, your emotional support, your loud voice, everything else that
Yeah.
you can give. But people who have money, let's act like prosperity gospel types here. If you throw it,
Plant the seed, man.
cast it on the waters and it's going to come back to you. Let's believe that. We cast our cash out there and maybe we'll provide safety and a bit more freedom and maybe restore some level of sanity to our democratic process if we are willing to invest in it.
Y'all, I like where we sort of ended up in this conversation. We've got a lot of heavy stuff to deal with, but there was a robust conversation about how to respond proactively with intention and strategy. And so, I'm kind of leaving with a sense of, all right, things suck right now, but also we have agency and we can take some actions here. And that's the spirit I want us to continue in. One of the things that I think is we're just going to have to get used to, and certain other his people groups historically have done this for a long time. You got to have the grief walking right alongside the action. And we can't wait for the grief to be over to take action and all of those things. We're just going to have to hold a lot of complex emotions and realities all at the same time. And we're going to have to support each other in that because we cannot hold it on our own. So we can do what we can do. We cannot save the world all in a day or by ourselves. What we can do is show up for each other. We can show solidarity and we can do what is in our hands to do. So I want to thank my co-hosts here, Robbie, Diana, Kristen. We have so many questions still lingering. Thank you so much for tuning in to this live episode of the Convocation Unscripted. Be sure to subscribe to our individual Substacks as well as convocation.substack.com. The link will be all in the show notes. We thank you for joining us on this. And with that, we will adjourn for this evening. We'll see you next time, folks.